Do not ask a powerful man to pretend. The words were not spoken to me directly at first, but I felt their weight before I even understood who had said them. The room was too quiet for comfort, the kind of quiet that made every breath feel like it belonged to someone else's decision. I stood there holding onto the last piece of courage I had left, forcing myself to look at Lucien Blackwell instead of the floor, because looking down meant collapsing into the version of myself I had been trying to escape for years. He did not move when I spoke. He never moved quickly, not because he was slow, but because nothing around him required urgency to obey. I swallowed hard and said it anyway. The sentence I had rehearsed in my mind until it no longer sounded like my own voice. Act like you love me. It came out smaller than I intended, but it did not break the silence. It simply entered it, as if the room had been waiting for those exact words to exist. Lucien did not respond immediately. His gaze stayed fixed on me, not harsh, not soft, but observant in a way that made me feel like I had already revealed more than I wanted to. I tried to explain, to correct the fragility in my tone, but he lifted a hand slightly, not to silence me, but to pause the moment itself. And then he said nothing again. That silence was not empty. It was evaluation. I felt it in the way the air seemed to tighten, in the way my thoughts suddenly became too loud inside my own head. I was not asking him to lie for me. I was asking him to stand beside me in a moment I could not survive alone, even if it was temporary, even if it meant pretending to be something we were not. The truth was simpler and more humiliating than I wanted to admit. Daniel Carter was coming, and I was not ready to face him as I was. I heard the door before I saw him. The sound of it opening did not feel like arrival, it felt like consequence. Daniel stepped inside with the kind of confidence that used to mean safety to me once, before it became something else entirely. His eyes moved first to me, then to Lucien, and something in his expression changed before he even spoke. It was not anger yet. It was recognition. The kind that arrives too late to prevent understanding. I saw the exact moment he processed the distance between what he expected and what was standing in front of him. Lucien finally turned slightly, just enough to acknowledge Daniel's presence without offering it importance. That small movement alone seemed to shift the air in the room again. Daniel's voice came out controlled at first, but control is fragile when it is built on assumptions that no longer hold. "What is this?" he asked, but he was not asking for information. He was asking for the version of reality that still made him central. I wanted to answer, but my throat tightened before sound could form. Lucien spoke instead. His voice was calm, almost conversational, as if the situation had already been categorized internally and required no emotional adjustment. "You are early," he said simply. That was when I realized something had already changed without permission. Daniel's gaze returned to me, searching for explanation, for correction, for the version of me that still belonged to the world he understood. But I could feel it slipping away even as I stood there. Lucien took a slow step closer to me, not touching, not claiming, but repositioning the space so that silence itself now included him in every direction. And in that moment, I understood that asking someone powerful to pretend is never about pretending at all. It is about what becomes real when someone like him decides to answer the silence after Daniel's arrival did not break, it simply redistributed itself. It was no longer centered on me alone, but stretched between 3 points in the room like something that had gained structure without anyone agreeing to it. I could feel Daniel trying to understand the shape of what he was seeing, but the problem was not what was visible. The problem was that nothing about it matched what he had prepared himself for. Lucien Blackwell remained calm, not in the way people try to appear calm, but in the way certainty removes the need for reaction. He did not look at Daniel the way I expected. Someone to look at an interruption. He looked at him the way someone looks at a variable entering an equation that was already in motion. Daniel took a step forward, then stopped again, as if the distance between them had an invisible boundary he had not agreed to cross. "What is going on here?" he asked again, but this time his voice was sharper, less controlled. His eyes flicked between me and Lucien, searching for alignment, for explanation, for anything that would restore his position in what he believed this moment was supposed to be. I tried to speak, but Lucien answered first, not raising his voice, not shifting his posture, simply letting words exist in the space as if they had always belonged there. You are not part of this moment in the way you think you are, he said calmly. Daniel let out a short breath, almost a laugh, but it carried no humor. That is not an answer, he replied. Lucien tilted his head slightly, acknowledging the statement without accepting its authority. I could feel my own position in the room becoming harder to define. I was no longer the center of explanation. I was becoming the point of convergence between two interpretations of reality that did not align. Daniel turned to me fully now, and for a moment I saw something familiar in his expression. Something from before confusion replaced certainty. Tell me what this is, he said, softer now, but still tense. The question was not really about Lucien. It was about whether I still belonged to the version of the world he understood. My mouth opened, but nothing came out immediately because I realized there was no version of the answer that did not change everything. Lucien moved slightly closer to my side, not touching me, not claiming me, but adjusting the geometry of the space so that his presence could not be ignored in any direction I turned. That single movement changed Daniel's focus again. I saw it in his eyes, the recalibration, the realization that something about access, proximity, and control had already shifted without his permission. You do not need to explain anything, Lucien said quietly, as if speaking more to me than to Daniel. Explanation only matters when control is uncertain. Daniel's expression tightened at that, and I could tell he understood enough of the implication to feel its impact even if he rejected its meaning. He looked at me again, and this time the question was not just confusion. It was displacement. As if he was no longer sure what role he had ever occupied in my life. I felt something inside me split between sympathy and distance, not because I stopped caring, but because the context of caring itself was no longer stable. Lucien finally turned his gaze fully toward Daniel. It was not aggressive, not emotional, but absolute in a way that made further argument feel unnecessary. You were not wrong to come, he said. You are simply late to a decision that is no longer yours to interpret. The words landed in the room without force, but they did not need force. Daniel stood still, and for the first time since entering, I saw uncertainty fully replace assumption in his expression. And in that moment, I understood that the request I had made was never about pretending to be loved, but about what becomes undeniable when someone powerful agrees to act as if reality itself has already been rewritten. The tension in the room did not escalate in the way conflict usually does. Instead, it settled into something quieter and more difficult to interpret, as if every person present had stopped trying to move the situation forward, and was instead adjusting to the fact that forward no longer meant the same thing for each of them. I remained where I was, caught between Lucien's stillness and Daniel's visible struggle to reconcile what he was seeing with what he believed should exist. Daniel shifted his weight slightly, his gaze still fixed on me, as if I could provide a version of reality that made everything coherent again. This does not make sense, he said finally, not directed at anyone specifically, but as if speaking to the structure of the moment itself. Lucien responded without turning fully toward him. It does not need to make sense to you in order to be consistent, he said. The statement hung in the air longer than expected, because it removed the assumption that understanding was required for something to be real. I felt my thoughts slow again, not because I was agreeing, but because I was beginning to notice how easily my expectations of normal explanation were being displaced. Daniel looked at Lucien now with something closer to frustration than confusion. So what is this supposed to be then? He asked. His voice carried the weight of someone trying to reclaim a position that had already shifted out of reach. Lucien finally turned to face him more directly, and the change in attention altered the room again. It was subtle, but I could feel it. When Lucien focused on someone completely, everything else became background. This is not something that is supposed to be anything, he said calmly. It simply is what remains when assumptions are removed. I saw Daniel process that in real time, not fully accepting it, but also no longer able to dismiss it with confidence. He looked at me again, and I could see the question behind his expression changing shape. It was no longer just about what was happening. It was about where he stood inside something he had not been prepared to enter. I felt a strange pull between sympathy and distance, because part of me still recognized him as someone who belonged to a previous version of my life, but another part of me could no longer locate that version with certainty. Lucien took a slow step to the side, subtly adjusting the spatial dynamic again, not blocking Daniel, not isolating me, but ensuring that no one in the room could remain in a fixed position of emotional control. You are trying to interpret a moment that is already complete, he said to Daniel. That is why it feels unstable. Daniel exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair, the first visible sign that his composure was no longer intact in the way it had been when he entered. So what am I supposed to do with this? He asked, quieter now. The question felt more human than strategic, and for a moment I almost answered it, but I did not know what answer would not deepen the fracture already forming between expectation and reality. Lucien looked at him for a long moment before speaking again. Nothing, he said simply. You are not required to resolve what you cannot influence. The simplicity of that statement made it heavier rather than lighter. I noticed Daniel's attention shift again toward me, searching for something familiar in my expression, something that would confirm he was still part of my emotional frame of reference. I wanted to give him that certainty, or at least something close to it, but I could feel how fragile any reassurance would be inside a situation that no longer behaved according to shared understanding. Lucien finally moved closer to me, not touching me, but positioning himself so that his presence became part of the immediate space I occupied rather than something separate from it. That small adjustment changed everything again without anyone speaking. Daniel saw it too. I could tell from the way his expression tightened, not in anger exactly, but in recognition that something had already been decided without his participation. And in that silence, I realized that the request I had made was no longer just about pretending to be loved, but about what it means when someone powerful does not act to deceive reality, but to redefine what reality is allowed to remain in the room. The room no longer felt like it was reacting to us. It felt like it had settled into a new configuration, one that none of the three of us had consciously agreed to, but all of us were now required to operate within. I stood still for a moment, noticing how even my attempt to remain neutral in position no longer created emotional neutrality. Every direction now felt interpreted. Every silence felt assigned meaning. Daniel remained near the center line of the space, but his stillness was different from Lucien's. It was the stillness of someone holding on to structure that was already beginning to dissolve. Lucien, on the other hand, remained composed in a way that did not suggest effort. It suggested permanence. Daniel finally spoke again, but his voice was lower now, less certain. So what now, he said, but the question had changed. It was no longer about explanation. It was about outcome. Lucien did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked at me briefly, not as a request for permission, but as if acknowledging that the next part of the situation involved my presence in a way that could no longer be secondary. That glance alone shifted something in Daniel's posture. I could see it in the way he tightened his jaw, as if realizing that attention itself was no longer distributed in the way he expected. Lucien finally spoke, calmly, without emphasis. Now you observe what you have already entered, he said. Daniel let out a short breath, almost disbelieving. I did not enter anything, he replied quickly, but even as he said it, the certainty in his voice felt weaker than before. Lucien tilted his head slightly, acknowledging the statement without validating it. Entry is not always recognized at the moment it occurs, he said. I felt my attention sharpen at that phrase, because it mirrored too closely the pattern I had been trying not to accept since the beginning of this night. I looked between them, noticing that I was no longer simply a participant in a conversation, but a reference point for how the conversation was being interpreted. Daniel took a step back, not away from me, but away from the structure that was forming around all of us. This is not real, he said quietly, but it sounded less like denial and more like an attempt to stabilize his internal framework. Lucien did not react to the statement at all. Instead, he turned slightly toward the desk again, as if the objects in the room still carried meaning even when human interpretation was unstable. Reality does not require agreement, he said. Only continuation. The simplicity of that sentence made it difficult to argue against, because it did not invite debate. It removed the premise on which debate usually exists. I felt a strange stillness inside myself, not calm, but alignment of fragments that had been resisting connection. Daniel looked at me again, and this time there was something different in his expression. It was no longer just confusion or frustration. It was the recognition that whatever connection he believed he still had access to was no longer responding in the way he expected. I wanted to say something that could restore balance, something that could return all of us to a version of this moment that felt understandable, but every possible sentence felt like it belonged to a version of reality that had already been left behind. Lucien finally moved closer to me again, not in a way that restricted space, but in a way that made space reorganize itself around his presence. That subtle shift was enough for Daniel to notice immediately. I saw it in the way his attention tightened, in the way silence became more charged rather than less. You brought him here, Lucien said quietly, not as accusation, but as recognition of cause. I hesitated, because the truth was more complicated than intention. I had not brought Daniel here physically, but I understood now that presence is not always measured in physical arrival. Daniel interrupted, his voice sharper again. I came here because of her, he said, but even as he spoke, it sounded less like ownership of reason, and more like an attempt to reclaim narrative position. Lucien looked at him then fully, and the room seemed to narrow its focus again. Yes, he said simply, and that is why you are part of it. The statement did not escalate tension. It finalized categorization. Daniel stopped speaking, not because he had nothing to say, but because the structure of the conversation no longer required his input to continue. I stood between them, realizing that what I had asked for was no longer the center of what was happening. The request had already expanded into something that no longer depended on intention, and the man I had asked to pretend was no longer acting at all, but operating within a version of reality that had begun to overwrite the one I thought I understood. The silence that followed Daniel's last statement was no longer the kind that needed to be filled. It had become part of the structure itself, as if every person in the room had accepted that words were no longer the primary way this moment was being defined. I could feel the shift most clearly in Daniel's posture. He was still standing, but no longer in the same way. It was as if the foundation of certainty beneath him had been subtly removed, leaving him upright but unsupported by anything familiar. Lucien remained calm, unchanged, but now I understood that his stillness was not passive. It was selective engagement. He only responded to what aligned with his internal structure of relevance, and everything else was simply allowed to fade without resistance. I looked at him and then back at Daniel, realizing that the tension between them was not a conflict in the traditional sense, but a mismatch in interpretation of what this situation even was. Daniel finally spoke again, but his voice lacked the earlier sharpness. So what am I supposed to do now? He asked, and for the first time the question sounded less like challenge and more like disorientation. Lucien did not answer immediately. Instead, he turned slightly toward me, and I felt the weight of that attention shift settle in a way I could not ignore. It was not a request, not pressure, but acknowledgement that I was now part of the interpretive center of the moment. That realization made my thoughts slow, because I could no longer pretend I was only observing the interaction between them. I was embedded inside it. Lucien finally spoke, his voice even and controlled. You are not required to do anything, he said to Daniel. What is already in motion does not depend on your participation to continue. Daniel exhaled, looking down briefly, and I could see the internal resistance that came from losing the ability to influence direction. He was not reacting emotionally in an explosive way, but in a contained recalibration, as if trying to find a new framework that could still include him. I felt a quiet unease in myself, because I recognized something similar happening internally. Not resistance but adjustment. Lucien moved a few steps, positioning himself slightly closer to me again, not in a possessive way, but in a way that made the geometry of the room subtly reorganize around him. The problem, he said calmly, is not misunderstanding. It is assuming you are still central to the system you are observing. Daniel looked up at him sharply at that, but did not respond immediately. I could feel the distance between what he believed and what was being described widening with each sentence. I wanted to intervene, to soften the edges of what was being said, but I realized even that impulse belonged to a version of me that still believed in restoring equilibrium. Lucien continued, his tone unchanged. You were not brought here as a participant in the way you assume, he said. You were brought here as confirmation of a condition already established. That sentence settled heavily in the room, not because it was aggressive, but because it removed ambiguity about purpose. Daniel finally spoke again, quieter now. So I am irrelevant, he said, but it was not a question anymore. Lucien looked at him directly. Relevance is not the correct framework, he replied. Continuity is. I felt my attention sharpen again, because the word continuity began to replace everything I had been using to understand this night. Daniel stepped back slightly, and for the first time his gaze shifted away from Lucien, and toward me without expectation, only uncertainty. I could see the question he was no longer able to articulate. Whether I was still reachable through the version of myself he remembered. I could not answer it, not because I did not want to, but because I no longer knew where that version of me ended. Lucien turned slightly toward the window again, as if concluding that nothing further needed to be resolved through dialogue. This does not end in disagreement, he said quietly. It continues until recognition stabilizes. I stood between them, realizing that what I had initiated was no longer functioning as a request, but as a structural shift in how each of us existed within this moment. And the man I had asked to pretend had never been pretending at all, because what he offered was not imitation, but a version of reality that only revealed itself once it could no longer be ignored. The atmosphere in the room no longer felt like it was shifting. It felt like it had already shifted, and was now simply revealing the consequences of that shift in slow, unavoidable detail. I stood in the center again without meaning to, as if my position was being determined less by choice and more by the way attention itself was distributed between Lucien and Daniel. Daniel had become quieter, but not calmer. It was the kind of quiet that comes when resistance is no longer productive, and the mind begins searching for a new framework, rather than continuing to argue with the old one. Lucien remained unchanged in posture, but I was beginning to understand that his stillness was not neutrality. It was control of interpretation, not of people. I looked at Daniel expecting another question, but he did not speak immediately. Instead, his gaze moved slowly between me and Lucien, as if trying to locate where the imbalance had begun. Finally, he said my name, but it sounded less like identification, and more like an attempt to reconnect me to a version of myself that made sense within his understanding. I did not respond right away, because I realized I was also struggling to locate that version of myself with the same certainty. Lucien spoke before I could answer. Names do not stabilize positions, he said calmly, as if responding to a question that had not been fully spoken. Daniel frowned slightly, his expression tightening again. Then what does? He asked, but his tone had lost its earlier confrontation. It now carried fatigue. Lucien turned slightly toward him, maintaining the same controlled distance. Recognition, he said simply. The word hung in the air without explanation, and for a moment no one spoke. I felt something subtle shift inside me again, not emotionally intense, but structurally, like pieces of understanding adjusting their alignment without permission. Daniel looked down briefly, then back up. So none of this is about me, he said, but there was no accusation in it now, only an attempt to confirm his reduced role in what was unfolding. Lucien did not deny it. He did not affirm it either. He simply said, "It is not centered on you in the way you assumed." That distinction mattered more than denial would have, because it did not remove him from the situation. It only redefined his position within it. I felt a strange heaviness settle in my chest, not fear, but awareness that the structure of meaning I had used my entire life was no longer fully applicable here. I took a slow step back, not away from anyone, but away from the assumption that I could interpret everything through familiar emotional logic. Daniel noticed my movement and looked at me more directly, and in that moment I saw something closer to vulnerability than confusion. He was no longer trying to win understanding. He was trying to confirm that I was still accessible through the version of connection we had shared before this night. I wanted to answer him in a way that preserved that connection, but I could feel how fragile any answer would be inside a reality that was no longer operating on shared assumptions. Lucien shifted his attention toward me again, not interrupting, but reintroducing structure into the space between us. "You are not required to resolve his interpretation," he said quietly. The sentence was not directed at Daniel, but it still affected him immediately. I could see it in the way his shoulders tightened slightly, not in anger, but in recognition that the conversation was no longer organized around mutual comprehension. I asked Lucien quietly what happens when interpretation no longer aligns between people who are still physically in the same space. He looked at me for a moment longer than before, and when he answered, his voice carried a level of certainty that did not require reinforcement. Then space stops being shared in the same way, he said. And presence becomes individual perception rather than collective agreement. I did not fully understand the implications of that, but I understood enough to feel its weight. Daniel exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair again. This time more slowly, as if trying to hold on to something internal that was beginning to loosen. So what now? He asked again, but it was no longer directed at anyone specifically. Lucien turned slightly toward the window, as if the conversation had reached a point where external reference mattered more than internal negotiation. Now, he said, you each adjust to the part of the moment that reflects you accurately. The sentence did not end anything. It redistributed meaning. I stood there between them, realizing that nothing about what I had initiated could be contained within the simple idea of pretending anymore, because what I had asked for had already evolved into something that no longer depended on performance, but on the irreversible shift that occurs when perception itself stops agreeing on what reality is supposed to be. I noticed that the room no longer felt divided in the way it had before. It felt instead like the division had completed itself, leaving behind three separate interpretations of the same space that could no longer fully merge into a single shared understanding. I stood still for a moment, realizing that even my sense of where I belonged in that physical layout was no longer stable. Daniel was no longer trying to assert himself in the same way. He had shifted into something quieter, something more internal, as if the energy required to resist had been replaced by the effort of reinterpreting everything he thought he knew. Lucien remained unchanged, but I was beginning to understand that his consistency was not emotional detachment. It was structural certainty, a way of existing that did not require validation from reaction. I looked at Daniel, expecting another attempt to reclaim clarity, but instead he simply asked a question that sounded more like exhaustion than confrontation. So what is she to you in all of this? He said, not looking at me directly at first, as if the answer might collapse something he was still holding together internally. Lucien did not respond immediately. Instead, he turned slightly toward me, and for a brief moment I felt the weight of being referenced rather than explained. That distinction mattered more than I expected. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady, without emphasis. She is not positioned in relation to ownership, he said. She is positioned in relation to recognition. Daniel frowned slightly, as if trying to translate the meaning into something that still fit within his previous framework of relationships. That does not answer anything, he replied, but even his objection lacked conviction now. Lucien did not engage with the resistance. He simply continued. It does not need to answer in your framework to remain accurate. I felt a quiet shift in myself again, not emotional but cognitive, as if I was being asked to observe my own presence from an angle I had not used before. I was no longer simply the subject of interpretation between two men. I was becoming the point around which interpretation itself was reorganizing. Daniel looked at me again, and I saw something softer in his expression now, not surrender, but the realization that the version of me he had come here to retrieve might no longer be accessible in the way he expected. I wanted to say something to him that would preserve continuity, but every sentence I considered felt like it belonged to a version of reality that had already started to dissolve. Lucien took a slow step to the side, subtly changing the geometry of proximity once again, and I noticed that even without physical contact, his movement influenced how the space was being perceived. You are still trying to locate meaning through comparison, he said quietly, now addressing Daniel directly. But comparison requires shared reference points, and those no longer align in this environment. Daniel exhaled, his shoulders lowering slightly, not in defeat, but in the recognition that resistance was no longer producing clarity. Then what remains? He asked, and this time the question felt less like challenge and more like genuine uncertainty. Lucien paused for a moment, then answered with the same controlled calm. Observation, he said. without the assumption that interpretation must resolve into agreement. I felt that sentence settle more deeply than the others, because it removed the pressure I had not realized I was carrying, the pressure to make everything coherent within a single emotional narrative. I turned slightly toward the window again, not to escape, but to reassess what it meant to remain present in something that no longer required mutual explanation to exist. Daniel was quiet now, and I could feel that his attention toward me had changed again. It was no longer about reclaiming something lost, but about trying to understand whether I had already crossed into a version of understanding that no longer included him in the same way. Lucien did not look at either of us for a long moment. Instead, he focused outward, as if confirming that the structure of this moment extended beyond the room itself. "Nothing here ends in conclusion," he said finally. "It only continues until each perspective stabilizes independently." I stood there between them, realizing that what I had asked for had never been about deception or performance, but about what becomes irreversible when truth is not spoken as agreement, but revealed as structure that no longer depends on being accepted in order to exist. I became aware of a shift in the room that was no longer about dialogue or disagreement, but about the gradual exhaustion of needing to define anything at all in the same way. I stood between Lucien and Daniel without moving for a moment, realizing that my physical position no longer represented emotional alignment in the way it used to. Everything had become relative to perception, and perception itself was no longer shared. Daniel finally spoke again, but his voice was quieter now, stripped of the earlier urgency. "So this is it," he said, not as a question directed at anyone in particular, but as a statement of resignation attempting to find structure in uncertainty. Lucien did not respond immediately. Instead, he looked toward the window again, as if confirming that nothing outside the room contradicted what was happening inside it. When he finally spoke, his voice remained calm, but it carried a sense of completion rather than continuation. "This is not an ending point," he said. "It is a stabilization point for different interpretations." I felt that sentence settle in a way that made everything before it feel like preparation rather than resolution. Daniel let out a slow breath, and for the first time he did not look at Lucien with resistance or confusion, but with the recognition that whatever framework he had used to define his relationship to me no longer produced a stable result. He turned his gaze toward me, and I could see something quieter there now, not possession, not expectation, but a kind of distance forming that had not been there before. I wanted to say something that could bridge that distance, but I could no longer find a version of language that belonged equally to both of us. Lucien stepped slightly closer to me, not in a way that interrupted Daniel, but in a way that clarified spatial interpretation for the room itself. I realized then that even subtle movement around him altered the way presence was understood, not because he forced it, but because everything around him adjusted to consistency. "You are both responding correctly within your own frameworks," Lucien said calmly, now addressing the situation rather than either of us individually. "But the frameworks are no longer aligned." Daniel looked down briefly, and I saw the moment where acceptance began to replace resistance, not as agreement, but as recognition that control had already shifted beyond access. I felt an unfamiliar stillness in myself, not emotional calm, but cognitive suspension, as if I was no longer required to resolve what I was witnessing into a single interpretation. I turned slightly toward the window again, and the city outside continued its movement without acknowledgement of any of this, which made its continuity feel almost reassuring in contrast. Lucien's voice continued, steady and precise. "What began as a request for simulation has become exposure to structure," he said. I understood the words individually, but together they created a distance between intention and outcome that I could no longer ignore. Daniel finally spoke again, but his voice no longer carried challenge. "So what happens to this?" he said, and for the first time I heard the question as something shared rather than directed. Lucien did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked at both of us in sequence, as if acknowledging that the question itself had already entered a different stage of relevance. "Nothing returns to its previous configuration," he said finally. "But that does not mean it stops existing." I felt that statement land in a place that did not feel emotional or intellectual, but structural, as if it defined the boundary between what could be reversed and what could only be understood moving forward. Daniel remained quiet after that, and I could no longer sense the urgency in him to reclaim anything from the version of this night he had entered with. I looked at him, and for a brief moment I saw the version of our history that still belonged to him, but it no longer felt like something I could step back into without breaking the continuity of everything that had formed since I spoke the words that started this chain of events. Lucien finally turned away from the window and spoke one last time, his voice steady and final without being harsh. "What you are experiencing is not conflict," he said. "It is transition between interpretive systems." And in that moment, I understood that what I had asked for was never about making someone pretend, but about what happens when reality itself stops requiring agreement in order to continue existing. I became aware that the room had reached a state where nothing further needed to be added for meaning to continue forming. The silence was no longer an absence of dialogue, but a completed structure that simply existed without requiring reinforcement. I stood between Lucien and Daniel, and for the first time in this entire sequence of events, I understood that my position was no longer the center of conflict, but the point where interpretation itself was being redistributed. Daniel no longer looked like he was trying to reclaim anything. His expression had softened into something quieter, not acceptance in the emotional sense, but recognition that resistance was no longer producing direction. Lucien remained unchanged in presence, but I could now see more clearly that his consistency was not dominance in the traditional sense. It was continuity without disruption, a form of certainty that did not rely on persuasion. Daniel finally spoke, but his voice carried none of the earlier tension. "So what is left after this?" he asked, and the question felt less like a challenge, and more like an attempt to locate the edge of something he could still define. Lucien did not answer immediately. Instead, he turned slightly toward the window again, as if confirming that nothing external contradicted the internal structure of what had already formed. When he spoke, his voice was steady, but there was no longer explanation in it, only articulation of condition. "What is left is interpretation without hierarchy," he said. I felt that phrase settle in a way that did not invite agreement or disagreement. It simply created a new reference point for everything that had occurred before it. Daniel exhaled slowly, and I could see the final trace of resistance leave his posture, not as defeat, but as the end of a function that no longer had utility. He looked at me one last time, and in that look I no longer saw expectation. I saw distance forming naturally, without hostility, without urgency, as if our shared interpretation had simply reached its limit of alignment. I wanted to respond, but I realized there was nothing I could say that would belong equally to both of our remaining perspectives. Lucien moved slightly closer to me again, not interrupting Daniel, but clarifying the spatial logic of the moment one final time. I noticed that even without physical contact, his presence defined how everything else was understood in relation to it. "There is no reversal point from here," he said calmly. "Only continuation through different levels of awareness." The sentence did not feel like closure. It felt like confirmation that closure was not part of the structure we were inside. Daniel nodded once, almost imperceptibly, and then stepped back, not leaving abruptly, but disengaging from the interpretive frame he could no longer maintain. I did not stop him. I realized I was not being asked to. Lucien did not follow him with his eyes. Instead, his attention remained within the room, as if what mattered was not departure, but the stabilization of meaning after departure had already become inevitable. I turned toward the window again, and the city outside continued its movement without acknowledging any of this, which made its continuity feel strangely aligned with what Lucien had been describing all along. "What began as a request," he said quietly behind me, "has completed its transformation into exposure of structure." I understood then that nothing in this night had ever been about pretending or performance in the way I had originally framed it. The request I made had not created an illusion. It had revealed a system that existed independently of my understanding of it. And as I stood there between what had been lost and what could no longer be reversed, I finally understood that the man I had asked to act like he loved me had never been acting at all. Because what I had mistaken for performance was actually the moment reality stopped requiring permission to change.